this event. I came to South Africa about 20 years ago, attracted, of course, by the beauty, the great weather, and the great university, but also by the promise the university was making at the time, which was a dedication to promote African scholarship, to help transform not just the South African Academy, which desperately needed it following apartheid, but really to invest in a continental forms of knowledge generation, to try to not only educate people so that they could compete and speak in global kind of academic spaces, but so that they could transform those spaces, that they had forms of knowledge, ways of seeing, ways of being, practices that could be different and could recenter debates around African scholarship, what it meant to be African, what it meant to generate knowledge in Africa, to engage in policy, public debate about what Africa should be and what it should become. Subsequently, I've worked and helped build the African Center for Migration and Society, an organization that has often come under attack for being un-South African, and if not just un-South African, anti-South African. In part because the work we do is on immigration in South Africa a lot. A lot of times we do hire people who speak French or Portuguese or Lingala or Swahili, languages that South Africans, despite their claim to decolonizing, still insist on not learning, right? And because a lot of the funding that we've got is for projects outside of South Africa, and so we will hire students and others there as well. We do have South African students, we do have South African staff, of course, but it's become an accusation. And that accusation has become even louder when we speak out against forms of exclusion, when we speak out against a university kind of transformation policy that sees a black African woman or a black African as the same as me, as a white American, in terms of transformation. That we count the same. That having someone who has deep experience on the rest of the continent as a migrant, as living, working elsewhere, that is not part of transformation at all. That the only transformation that counts is the hiring of a certain type of demographic here. We've also come under accusations, maybe less in the university than outside, when we speak out against some of the policies, whether it's street traders, whether it's immigration, whether it's about beauty pageants, right? About debates over what does it mean to be a South African? What does it mean to have rights to be here? And I think that hasn't stopped us. We continue to try to fight. I think on migration issues now, we're seeing in South Africa, but it's not just here. It is a global phenomenon. These are at the center of politics. Discussing who has a right to be where is something that is shaping sort of the politics of this country, as Nikki was saying before, but also the politics of Europe, the politics of the United States, the politics of Australia. This is the times we're in, and we need to continue to have these conversations, and that's part of why we're here. And part of why we're here is to ask, what is the role of the university, specifically, in helping to bring about those, or to foster those conversations, to make those changes, and what within the university do we need to address? So it's nice to say that we think policy around immigration is wrong, but what about our own HR policies? What about, as we've heard before, about the content of our classrooms, the way we teach, the way we hire? So we've asked 3 people here who are not only sort of practitioners and teachers or scholars, but also scholars or people who've thought a lot about what higher education is and what it should do. So the 3 people you have in front of us, and I'll turn it over to them now, are Samia Chasi, William Pofu, and Salim Valley, sorry. Samia is, I'm going to read her bio because she sent it to me and I've got it. The other ones I took off the web, so you'll correct me if I get anything wrong. Samia is an accomplished practitioner, scholar, and facilitator with over 25 years of experience advancing internationalization and cultivating strategic partnerships. She's currently the head of the Wits University's Internationalization and Strategic Partnerships Office. A mouthful, right? Before this, she was the manager of strategic initiatives, partnerships, development, and research at the, everything you've done has very long names, right? At the International Education Association of South Africa. Her career includes roles with the international offices of German and South African universities, an agency of the European Commission, and South Africa representation of the German Academic Exchange Service. Nuffic and the British Council. She is a WITS product, proudly Witsy, has her PhD in education from here, and then a Master's of Philosophy in Engineering Management, so we do get a bit of the sciences here, but then also a Master's of Arts in English, Russian, and Sociology. So she has worked a lot, and her interests lie in critical perspectives on higher education internationalization, with a particular focus on decolonial approaches. So you can see absolutely the right type of person to have here. The second person in the middle there is Dr. William Mpofu. He's a researcher here at WITS with the Center for Diversity Studies, working with Nikki. His research interests, according to the website, is decoloniality, especially the province of the philosophy of liberation and methodology of undisciplinarity. So perhaps following up directly on some of the issues Srila raised, his latest book, or the latest book that showed up for me was called Robert Mugabe and the Will to Power. That's still the latest. I'm sure there's other work coming. Will to Power in an African Post-Colony, and that's by Palgrave Macmillan. The last person on my right, on your left, is Professor Salim Valley. He is the Research Chair in Community, Adult, and Worker Education at the University of Johannesburg. And also, it seems, a visiting professor at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan. Is that still right, Salim? Okay, good. His doctorate was at UKZN, and he's studied at WITS and York Universities, and has been a visiting lecturer at the University of York, Columbia, Virginia, and Fort Hare, and well-spoken and visited many other places. His scholarly interests, which is why we've invited him here, include educational and social policy as it relates to human rights, democracy, and socioeconomic justice. So as you can hear, three people who've all spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, and will spend a little time, about 10 minutes each, sharing their perspectives with you and with the people online. We'll then open it up for conversation afterwards. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Samia.
Thank you very much. I had a first chapter at WITS, and that is when I first met Lauren. So I'm actually really so excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few of my thoughts and reflections and lessons learned perhaps of those 25 years that I've spent working in international education. I want to start actually by acknowledging the legacy of Rhodes Must Fall in terms of the importance of the movement to me, but also to the work that I do. Rhodes Must Fall actually shifted the perspective of my PhD. The topic was North-South partnerships in higher education. And when I started, I kind of like thought, oh, I'm going to use this lens and that lens. And in the end, I discarded everything and employed a decolonial lens. And so decolonial approaches, like you said, Lauren, keep playing an important part in the work that I do. And I want to talk a little bit about that. But also to say that Rhodes Must Fall as a movement, because it gained traction internationally, is actually a really good example of having decolonization conversations internationally with our international partners, to break down what the importance and the necessity for this movement was in terms of the key questions that students and others, of course, asked around, what are students learning in South African universities, who's teaching them, how are they being taught, where are they being taught, and all of these kind of like core questions. And the importance of that is, on the one hand, to explain South Africa and explain higher education in South Africa and explain why transformation, decolonization, and Africanization are pertinent issues for us to address. But the other aspect of working internationally and working in partnerships is that you actually realize that there are similarities and synergies with the people that you engage, and this is across the board. So recently I spent quite a bit of time in Brazil, and of course a decolonization conversation resonates with colleagues in Brazil. Mostly the conversations that I have had have centered around inequality in education, access, and of course also relevance. But these conversations are also important with partners in the global north. So you discover, for example, that decolonization conversations in Canada are very much framed around indigenous research and inclusion of indigenous peoples and languages and knowledges. But you also talk to European colleagues around marginalized communities in the global north, right? And this takes us, I think, to perhaps another conversation at some point to really dig into the complexities of these terms. And I think they are becoming increasingly useless to me, actually, because, you know, South Africa, Srila, you mentioned this, South Africa is such a complex case. We are global north, global south, and everything in between, right? And so I think this is something that is particularly important. But I think without Roads Must Fall, I would have, for example, not been invited to a policy dialogue on decolonization hosted by the Dutch embassy in Pretoria, bringing Dutch and South African universities together. We would have also not had annual conferences hosted by the International Education Association of South Africa, where we bring internationalization into conversation with transformation, decolonization, Africanization, and social justice. So I think, you know, that for me is part of the change that I see. And it's perhaps not at the systemic level and at the structural level, but it is something that is happening in my space. So I just wanted to kind of like kick things off with that. And then in terms of the topic of the day, I thought in terms of preparation, what are some of the things that I can offer in such a short period of time? And so I would like to really kind of like maybe focus on 3 key issues. The one thing that concerns me a lot, and many colleagues who work with me in this space, is the intersections between internationalization and transformation, and whether these two are actually competing agendas for universities, not only in South Africa, but let's focus on South Africa. This, for me, is very closely linked to conversations around academic xenophobia, and I will frame that a little bit more. And then, of course, you know, what you have invited us to do here is to talk a little bit about where we're going from here. What's the future of the South African or African university, particularly in the global context? So let me start with a few reflections on what I often see are actually considered to be competing agendas of internationalization and transformation. And perhaps one can say internationalization is this kind of global imperative, right? That institutions have to be international, have to attract international students, staff. We have to do research globally and internationally. We have to increasingly get more funding from international donors, etc. And how does this relate to what we could perhaps call a local imperative of transformation and decolonization, particularly in the South African context? And just to share with you, this is something that I first kind of like came across with a lot of clarity when I did interviews for my PhD research. As I said, I was looking at North-South partnerships in higher education, and I used Wits University as a case study. So a lot of the things that I'm going to say are from colleagues who are still around. You know, one of my colleagues really highlighted also that link that we make between, we talk about xenophobia, but we know it's Afrophobia, right? It really affects, and a lot of colleagues said this before, black colleagues from the continent who are based here in South Africa. And one of my interview participants said, you know, employment equity rules mean that we are not black. This was a scholar from Ghana. And that really feels like an institutional rejection in the sense that the policies of the state constitute a rejection of the value that we bring, right? I thought this was an interesting a quote that kind of like, you know, encompasses a lot of the things that we heard about also in the first panel. I want to shift from there to the national policy framework. So a lot of the work that we do in international education is guided by the policy framework for internationalization of higher education in South Africa, which is a document that was published by our Department of Higher Education and Training in 2019. It was first fully promulgated in the middle of COVID, actually, towards the end of 2020. And there they talk a little bit about this relationship between internationalization and transformation, and importantly in the context of international staff mobility and international staff recruitment. And I'm going to quote some sections there that I think are really quite informative in terms of the conversations that we've had. Because it says there, for example, and I quote, "It is in South Africa's interests to appoint the best possible people in academic positions in its higher education institutions, including talented and qualified scientists and scholars from elsewhere in the world." But then they also say in the next clause, there can be no justification for any South African institution prioritizing and preferring foreign nationals to South Africans who qualify equally for the same post. So there you go. I think that's a direct tension between internationalization and transformation, and I think we have to address this very, very carefully and deeply. What I thought was encouraging for me, that recently there was a call for expressions of interest to become members of a reference group on the implementation strategy of this policy framework that I just quoted. And there, interestingly, they said the role of the reference group will include, among other things, best possible strategies to ensure that all universities participate in internationalization activities, which should encompass the aspect of transformation within South African universities. And another key element was to advise on ensuring how there can be alignment with principles of decolonization and transformation. That's the first time that decolonization as a term came up actually in reference to the DHET policy framework. So I'm looking forward to the work of this reference group and see, you know, how can they kind of like lead some of these conversations at the national level. Linked to what I've just touched on, and this is the second point that I want to just briefly speak about, you know, share some reflections on the topic of academic xenophobia. When I was still at IESA, the International Education Association of South Africa, it is quite long, Lauren, we teamed up with the British Council to commission a piece of research, the first national research on internationalization of higher education at public universities. 19 out of the 26 universities participated. I'm happy to share the research report for anyone who's interested. It's available online. But one of the things that I wanted to particularly reflect on is that they really found that academic xenophobia stands to, you know, be a real challenge and barrier to internationalization in South Africa. They particularly talked about recruitment practices. They talked about the role of unions in recruitment processes and interviews at universities. And of course, I think to some extent, Shrila, you talked about this case at UCT, but there have been many other conversations and perhaps most prominently recently discussions in the Parliament Portfolio Committee on Higher Education. But what I thought was really quite interesting, and you know, I would encourage everybody to, you're probably very familiar with the kind of arguments that are being presented, you know, in terms of some of the political discourse around foreigners and particularly illegal migrants, but in this case, of course, also those scholars that we are trying to attract. And what I thought was really quite interesting, and I don't know if that really has happened a lot, but the then Deputy Minister Manamela, Deputy Minister of the Department of Higher Education and Training, published an opinion piece in the Daily Maverick. I don't know how many of you saw that. I thought it was really quite interesting. I don't know how often, William, that happens, but for me it was really noticeable. And there's a few things that I wanted to pull out just in terms of quotes from that. First of all, he says, let's be clear. South African universities are not flooded with foreign staff. They are struggling still to become truly representative of our demographics, values, and developmental priorities. But foreign nationals are not the obstacle. The real crisis lies in our failure to invest in and grow a new generation of Black South African academics. And he lists a kind of like a whole, you know, list of real barriers to transformation, shrinking an unequal postgraduate pipeline, exclusionary institutional cultures, poor working conditions and heavy teaching loads, fragmented policy and funding support, etc. And he says these are the bottlenecks, not fellow scholars from Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Ghana or Kenya. And he kind of like closes with this. Let's fix the real problems. Underfunding, institutional inertia, a lack of coherence in building academic careers. But let us not turn fellow scholars into enemies. In the battle for transformation, our best allies are those who believe in justice, equity, and the power of shared knowledge. And I thought, you know, this is a man who was a deputy minister at the time, who now, of course, you know, is our minister of the Department of Higher Education and Training. And I think it speaks directly to some of the things that we are discussing today. And then perhaps as a final part, very briefly for me to reflect on some of the thoughts around you know, some of the framing around this colloquium, around the role of South African or African universities. And of course, I'm going to put this into the global context. Well, first of all, I think we need to ask critically what makes us African. Are we African universities or are we universities in Africa? This is not a new debate, but I do think it's important to come back to that. So what actually is that Africanness and how does it manifest in everything that happens in the university in terms of our core functions, you know, teaching and learning, research, community engagement? A lot of you already, you know, we touched on some of those things. And then what is interesting to me is to then say, once we know what it is, how can we bring it into our partnerships? How can we bring it to a global stage? Because I think that is what internationalization is all about. The colonial element of it, I think, was about bringing the world to us. But now I think we are challenged to say, how do we bring Africa to the world? How do we bring South Africa into our partnerships? How do we use these partnerships to build African institutions? And so bringing the local into conversation with the global and vice versa, I think that's really important. And one of my research participants said, you know, we're not bringing the resources, we're not bringing the infrastructures, we're sometimes not bringing the, you know, human capital, the capacity, but we are bringing academic rigor, we're bringing criticality, we're bringing experience with inclusion and transformation, and these are some of the things that we need to be aware of. And in that sense, another participant used this phrase, and I've kept going back to it, you know, to see the global south as an invitation to imagine the world afresh. And so for us to be critical and really reflect very critically on everything that we think we know and everything that we do, and really kind of like influence, you know, these changing paradigms of north-south partnerships, south-south collaborations and all of that. And two closing thoughts. Wits University has just decided to become a signatory of the Africa Charter for Transformative Research Collaborations. I wonder if that will not give us a concrete kind of like framework to test, you know, our relationships with, and to say, how can we use this? Nikki, I think you asked, you know, for very practical and pragmatic things. How can we use these principles, which are wonderful and you can agree with them, but what does it mean in the context of the work that we do? How do we translate equality into a research collaboration project? How do we translate it into a joint degree or a student exchange or a collaborative online international learning program? These are some of the things that I think are important for us. And as a final provocation, and this comes from a conversation that I was part of this very morning with our senior executive team about diversifying funding sources. How can we build African universities when we continue on donor funding from the global north, to rely on it, sorry, continue to rely on donor funding from the global north? Thank you.
Hello? Okay. Prof, can I beg your kindness to allow me to stand?
Yes.
And no, okay, it helps me to remember things faster. Okay. All right, quickly, my presentation is going to be on undisciplinarity, the nature of the decolonized university in Africa. It's an extract from one of the essays in my forthcoming book, which is Africa Otherwise, Essays in the Philosophy of Liberation by Bloomsbury from Rowan and Lichfield. Right, I think it is important, if we are to use a philosophy of liberation imagination to imagine a decolonized university in Africa and what it will look like, to pay attention to the provenances, the origins of the university that we are working in, which is the Euro-American model, which has become hegemonic globally. We are in South Africa, in Gauteng, but we are working within the westernized university in Africa, as Ramon Crossfocal has illustrated. Right, this institution is traceable to the Western Dark Ages, which were the theosophical ages, where knowledge-making was religious activity, where knowledge production was the property of theological officials, prophets, priests, pastors, and other characters. You could not come from outside the perimeters of those institutions and claim to make knowledge. You will be punished by death. People were bent at the stakes for pretending to produce knowledge otherwise. You know, the Galileo and others who came up with alternative ideas, they paid a certain price. Even Jesus Christ paid a price for claiming to be this and that and all that. My time is limited, so I'll move very fast. During that theosophical age, knowledge was expected to come from inspiration and from certain offices. That was disciplinarity at its zenith. You could not be a woman, a non-religious officer, a black person, or any other class or category of people and claim to produce and circulate knowledge. That was the beginnings of disciplinarity. And the claim that knowledge comes from above and it's not for everyone. And this institution still carries some of the characteristics of that institution. You still have the pulpit there. Prof wanted me to stand there. The gowns that we wear, the caps that we wear, and the classifications where you have professors as prophets and others as disciples. The academic procession illustrates and dramatizes that very well. You still have that mesa, which is the cross, and other rituals, and all that. I'm glad in Prof's inaugural lecture, there was alternative music, which was not part of that ritual and all that. Right. The Enlightenment era, which came, it's called Enlightenment because it came after the Dark Ages. It claims to have brought in the light, disrupted that, and claimed that knowledge could be produced through rationality, science, and other means, and that man could conquer the universe through philosophy. By the way, in that era, everyone was a philosopher. That's why you still have daughter of philosophy, even if you are doing sciences. It comes from that era as well. That vocabulary, that diction comes from there. Right, they said, no, the theosophical setup of producing and circulating knowledge is superstitious. It must be dethroned and replaced with secular approaches to producing knowledge. That's why the Enlightenment is also called the death of God and the birth of man as thinker and a scientist and the conqueror of the universe. Before I go into the disciplines and how the Enlightenment shaped them, I need to reflect on that. As the Enlightenment produced some of the best ideas on liberty, inventions, technology, and all that, it also was the period where ideas of conquest were generated. So when they said they will conquer the universe with their minds, they really also meant imperialism, conquest, enslavement, and colonization. So for some of us in the global south, it became the Darkenment as well. And the blooding of the world with dead bodies, genocides, and epistemicides, and all that. Right, the Enlightenment was not at peace for a long period of time. There were internal fights. There's a group of individuals that came up and said, hey, this philosophy is taking us back to the theosophical era. What is the difference between metaphysics and superstition? Interpretive analysis, philosophical paradigms, they are not based on evidence. We want empirical evidence. That was the birth of the sciences that are now called the hard sciences or the natural sciences and all that. They broke away from philosophy, and then they went on to break down into provinces of their own, biology, chemistry, physics, and engineering, and all that. And the philosophers remained there with the humanities, the arts, and all that. But quickly enough, another group of individuals came and said, we love philosophy, but we also love empirical evidence. Where do we go? That was the birth of the social sciences. That's why they still go and do field works, they do experimentation, but after that go to their desks and their closets and do interpretive, metaphysical analysis. So that was another breakaway, which brought in more and more disciplines, beginning with history as the first social science going forward. So disciplinarity developed like that. So epistemic borders were created by disciplines, because disciplines do not only get called disciplines, they're discipliners. That's why we wake up in the morning trying to defend the discipline that we belong to. Because we're disciples, we're followers. We have to cite the canons, canonical scholars, the prophets in the field. And they are mainly fathers father of sociology, father of psychology, father of... The only discipline that was given to women, not surprisingly, is the nursing field. And it's for those reasons that women are expected to nurse all of us and make us comfortable and heal us wherever we are and stuff like that. Otherwise, every discipline has a father, has a prophet and all that. Right, let's leave that becoming that birth of the disciplines and run forward to the French Revolution and what it did to the disciplines and the way we experience the academy right now. Anyway, a few years before the French Revolution, you had two important books that haunt the academy up to today, even here in Africa. 1776, there was Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is a manifesto of capitalist economics. All other economic theories and all that, they fed from Adam Smith. And the wealth of nations that is described there is the wealth of Western nations, which was going to be built on empire building, conquest, siphoning of resources, use of slave labor, and other extractivist violences. At the same year, Charles Darwin wrote The Origins of the Species, which became the manifesto of scientific racism, that there is inferior species and fit species, superior species or fit species, and racial thinking, racial practices, and other performances are still guided by that. Yeah. So when the French Revolution came, 1789, it produced new entities and a new form of society as we have become to know, and as it was imposed on the global south. First, there was the civil society, then the state, then the market. Adam Smith's ideas had already filtered through society and all that. The state needed a discipline called political science, which taught how to rule by consent and cohesion at the same time. Quickly, the civil society needed sociology. That's why guys like Auguste Comte came and said, how do we study societies, how they are formed and all that. Sociologists will tell us more about that. And then the market needed economics. So whenever power shifts, whenever power changes, it produces academic disciplines to understand knowledge. So Foucault was not the first to ever clarify the relationship between knowledge and power. Whenever power wants to fortify itself, it creates ways of making knowledge, disciplinary ways of making knowledge that will sustain it. Down the centuries, 1945, when America came into world prominence after the war, there was a challenge to American supremacy and power. The Bretton Woods Conference had set in 1944. 1945, now America had to govern, dominate the world, including the global south. But there was a specter of Soviet communism, the specter of Chinese communism, and these needed to be managed. America needed to infiltrate global south economies and polities. They invented development studies, which Walter Rodney correctly called the development of underdevelopment, because the name suggests development, but the articles of that discipline refer to underdevelopment, exploitation, and all that. That's what IMF, World Bank, and other entities of the Bretton Woods regime are here to do, to tell you what to do with your economy, and to wake up in the morning and being told the rand is here, today is there, today is there. Who decides that? Some people. But we're told it's the market forces and all that. Superstitions and stuff. Quickly, I think, Prof, let me go to my closing. What is the University of the Global South going to look like? And I insist on Global South, not South Africa or Africa. It simplifies, it provincializes, and villagizes decolonization to reduce it to a certain jurisdiction which was created by colonialists anyway. Because they were not going to be foreigners if there were no borders. They were not going to be foreigners if there were no maps. So if we're going to decolonize at the same time we are respecting the colonial borders and respecting the colonial, what are we doing? There's something anti-colonial in that approach. And there's something disciplinary in that approach and all that. I think the first quality of, Prof, I'll run through this quickly. The first quality of a decolonized university of the Global South will be human diversity. This institution should be populated by human beings from different directions of the world. It's a colonial myth that decolonization means expelling white people from the university, expelling Asians from the university, and erecting black people as the owners of the university. That's colonial propaganda. Decoloniality, especially as the philosophy of liberation, respects human diversity. That diverse bodies should circulate here with the knowledges that they embody, create that friction which is productive epistemically. Second point, this institution should be punctuated by epistemic diversity, which means that Plato should be read alongside Credo Mutwa. Shakespeare should be read alongside Wallace Rotwe. You know? Machiavelli should be read alongside Che Anta Diop and other indigenous thinkers. The library should be an archive that is punctuated with epistemic diversity. The reading list should create that, not conviviality, but that plurality and multiplicity which make epistemic diversity. Because the truth, knowledge, might be too wide to come from one mouth of a white Christian male figure. All of us come from legitimate knowledge producing societies and communities. Third, Prof, I think the other important quality of this institution would be multilingualism. Multilingualism. The issue with languages is that there's no language that walks on its own, on its 2 feet or 3 feet. Languages are embodied. So if you marginalize Xhosa, if you marginalize Venda, if you marginalize Zulu, if you marginalize Ndebele in the university, you have excluded people from those identity groups and compelled them to learn in languages that are alien to them. The question I always get when I talk about this is, how feasible is it to introduce languages like that in the university? Ngugi's last book is The Language of Languages, where he talks about translation as the language of languages. The biggest department in any university should be the translation department, which will allow students and staff from different language groups to do work in their languages, and then the work gets translated for exchange. That is feasible. The best example that any language can be developed into a language of science, knowledge, and profession is Afrikaans. 1903 primary school, 1913 high school, 1925 parliament and the courts, 1933 the Afrikaans Bible. As we speak, there are people who have studied in Afrikaans, are working in Afrikaans, are living in Afrikaans. Any language can be built like that, from a dialect to a language of science. Fourth, Prof, I'm getting there. The other quality is producing knowledge as a human good. Because this westernized institution has turned knowledge into a commodity. That's what Fees Must Fall was challenging. Let's have good higher education, quality education, affordably, or for free, for those who deserve it. Mahmoud Mamdan wrote a very nice book in 2010 called Scholars in the Marketplace, where, not in so many words, he illustrated that these institutions are supermarkets of diplomas and degrees, because knowledge is sold and bought, and the people who deserve it don't afford it, and they are excluded. The next quality from there is this institution should be combining both excellence and relevance. That this university should be rooted in Africa, but should also be globally relevant and globally competitive. If you meet the propagandists against decoloniality, they will tell you that when you bring black people here, you bring women here, you bring foreigners here, you will affect the standards and quality. It's a colonial myth because it assumes that quality is isolated to a certain identity group. That once you have Xhosa here, then quality has gone. Once you have Venda here, then standards have gone. Once you have women producing knowledge, then standards have gone. That's how colonial and racist that argument can go. The truth is that standards and quality can be worked on by any people that embody, engage in knowledge production and circulation. So decolonizing does not mathematically lead to the lowering of standards. There's a nice book by a lady called Ariana Stokas, that describes what is called a reparative university, which means that the university of the future should be reparative. It should recognize and understand the wounds of slavery, the wounds of colonialism, the wounds of sexism, the wounds of ableism, the wounds of misogyny that the people of the global south have. And it should be a site where these wounds can be attended to. Where these wounds can be attended to. Last, Prof, this university must have inclusive infrastructure. By inclusive infrastructure, not only that, even colleagues, students, and other members with, who live with certain inabilities and impairments can access the buildings, but also that the campus landscape should not host statues, figurines, artifacts of empire builders, colonizers, and slave owners. Rose Masfall taught us that students get irritated, staff get irritated by idols of empire, performances of empire on campus, and all that. That's why I always celebrate when students do indlamu on stage during graduation, and traditional dances, dress, poems, and all that. Prof, thank you so much for the indulgence. Colleagues, thanks for the
I can toy and dance at the same time. Okay. Okay, thanks very much, Nikki, Lorena, Lenore, and Lauren. I wrote it down because it's tongue alliteration. This is wonderful discussion, and I've learned so much from all the panelists. I was going to be in the first panel, and then there was a desperate call by Nikki to any volunteers for the second panel. So for my sins, and also because penance, I didn't get to your inauguration. I decided, okay. So therefore, this few points I have, you know, it's a liminal space. It's about the past, 2015, 2016. Of course, it's not a past transcended, nor is it past as nostalgia. But I want to also talk about the current situation and things that were not current then in the way they are today. The fact that we have an out-and-out brazen xenophobe and racist in the cabinet, you know, and his criminal sidekick, the Sushi King, MMC of Gauteng. So things have changed for the worse, as Nkolisi said, in society generally. It's not a linear teleological forward march. There's zigzags. But I want to say that, and you know, it's an appreciation too of Fees Must Fall, the possibilities it's proffered, but also the real possibilities of co-option as well. So with all its contradictions, its omissions, its ambiguities, its antinomies, we all know it was not a homogeneous movement. But with all of that, it was a call for the higher education system to be in the interests of the public good, or social good, as William says. And not an insignificant number of students and staff talked about intersectionality of, class exploitation, racism, different forms of oppression, in very concrete ways, as it affected them. And it forced the university, despite the unequal power imbalance, to at least, in a rhetorical way, address these issues, many of which were then co-opted. I'm not going to go into details, but I think people know what I'm talking about. But it was also an exasperation with the sophistry of the ruling class. It was a frustration with thwarted hopes, for many people, even those who come to universities like Wits, the expectations of them in their families, their communities, their neighborhoods, that was not realized. The alienation people felt. But also the everyday injuries of mere survival under a patriarchal, racial, capitalist system. And I think Fikile talked about that in a very graphic, powerful way. But it was also the failures of an economic system which has increased inequality and unemployment over the past 30 years, and the venality of politicians and the brazen excesses of cronyism. So those were not in the everyday discourse, but this movement, like all movements, throws these issues up, and they'll throw them up again. So I think we have to recognize that. So the second point I want to make is that can you have decolonization in a neoliberal university? I think that question has not been answered. There's a lot of literature since then, even with Black Lives Matter. There's Olimu Otiawo about elite capture, how everything, how identity and everything else was captured by the elite. It's a brilliant book. It's also a book about that can be applied to South Africa. The promises made about anti-racist or non-racial South Africa. And many of us believe that once you separate racism from capitalism, because our country developed through racial capitalism, racism has been part of the warp and woof of the capitalist system. So clearly it was not just about colonial and apartheid era statues, as important as they are. We're still very close to Jan Smuts and Empire Road. I'm not sure if that was on the agenda. But perhaps, xenophobia was not on the agenda either. But it opened up possibilities to address that. What is solidarity? There was solidarity with workers. The outsourcing movement linked up. There was solidarity with people fighting against patriarchy and femicide in very concrete, real ways. There was solidarity between universities. And that goes against the corporate university and the neoliberal university. UJ is the greatest university. Wits gives you the edge. The branding exercises, the PR, the ratings and ranking regime is opposed to solidarity. It encourages competition, it encourages individualism in so many concrete ways, too many for me to spell out, and it's antithetical to what the purpose of the university is. A university, as Stuart Hall said, a university is a critical institution or it is nothing. And part of being a critical institution is solidarity with all these things I've mentioned, but also social justice. By the way, if anybody finds a reference to that quote, because I've read it everywhere, but I can't find a reference, please give it to me. But of course, the context has changed. Has the context changed? And if it has not, why not? I mean, Kolisi says that, in fact, arguably, it's become worse. So I think because the fault lines have not been challenged, there was an attempt to do that, a tentative, a latent attempt, but it didn't get to the conclusion. So today, for the very few students from working class communities, black working class communities, other working class communities, who make it to tertiary institutions, life is a constant struggle. And for most of middle class students, increasingly as well, who fall through the cracks, as we know, and the whole model that they put in place relies on financial institutions who benefit because of the loans. I mean, it was fascinating that after the Hair Commission, these billboards went up outside universities, banks advertising for loans. You know, that's not free education at all, but, you know, I don't want to go into too many details there. And of course, we know the costs of higher education have been increasing all the time, and the burden falls largely on students, black working class students. And there's pressure on staff, and there's austerity on staff. And of course, most universities are under severe financial strain, and there's inordinate pressure. And the huge increase in student numbers, although most who qualify to be in universities don't get to the universities, as we know, even those who get to universities, it's not matched by the recruitment of staff. And today, over 60% of academic staff are actually on temporary contracts without job security. And that's going to get worse as austerity bites in different ways. So in terms of transformation, together with decolonization, together with the latest buzzword, community engagement, it's become a tick box exercise. I think we all know this. The substance has been taken out. Its glossiness, its glossy rhetoric, and of course it's contradicted at every turn and at all levels by the rapid development of what they call an entrepreneurial university. Many years ago, Rhodes and Slaughter wrote this book on academic capitalism and how it works. And that's what we have here now. So a limited understanding of transformation often includes those substantial issues of power, of social relations, institutional culture, managerialism, meaningful curricular reform, issue of languages in the university, and the commodification of knowledge production. as well as democratic decision-making, relations between universities and communities, how knowledge is disseminated, the 5 multinational corporations that own the journals that you have to, publish or perish. We publish while others perish. So can we have this transformation? Can we have the solidarity in a situation where we have increasingly a corporatist, managerialist, and commercialized university? These are not new questions. These questions were posed a long time ago. And the debate happened theoretically, but also on the ground. The debate started at a very early age after the Universities Extension Act, which prevented black students from going to white universities. It started with the Cape Peninsula University Society, Western Cape. People like Archie Mafeje, Neville Alexander, they started grappling with what the purpose of a university is. What should the vision be? Later on, in the 80s, I'm skipping many decades, we had the People's Education Movement, which was not limited to schools alone. There were many initiatives. Then, of course, we had, people like Harold Wape, people like George Subotsky, who were very involved in debates about higher education. But before that, we had the BC movement, SASO, their involvement with communities, their understanding of what the university should be all about, the links between universities and community. In many universities like this one, at that time University of Natal, etc., we had even white students, left white students, liberal white students, linked up with the trade union movement. So this, we're talking about our own history, but these histories are found in other countries. And because we're talking about xenophobia, I'm going to skip this very important subject of 4IR, which UJ talks about. But you can imagine what I'm going to say, and I can pass you a critical paper on that, as a panacea, which I think is just deflecting from the real issues we face today, and in fact increases inequality, increases the power of the tech companies. And if we look at what Google and others are doing today, they're completely implicated in some of the most vile things, including the genocide in Palestine through AI. But I want to skip all of this to say that our continent, and this is the pity of this narrow, parochial, xenophobic perspective, because it doesn't give us the richness of the struggles of the brilliant people in the academy. Although there was this debate between Ali Mazrui and Walter Rodney William, Mamdani wrote up this debate. I support Walter Rodney, not Ali Mazrui, on the role of the African University. I won't go into detail. But there were people in the University on the Hill, Dar es Salaam, that grappled with these issues a long time ago. Dar es Salaam was a place where all the Southern African liberation movements were there, and academics from around the world. They tried to create something different. It was the time of Nyerere's Ujamaa. Now I feel like standing up, William. I'll desist. They were critical of Ujamaa, but they were looking at the different disciplines, how it can link to the post, in the first flush of independence, the creativity, the innovation, etc. They had these journals called Maji Maji, Cheche, and people like Issa Shivji, Walter Rodney, John Sauls. I can go on and on. Unfortunately, the chap from Uganda went astray, but that's another question. He was part of that radical group as a student. So I'm going to end here by just recalling a book that tries to capture these debates. And the title of the book is Under Education in Africa, From Colonialism to Neoliberalism by Hirji. Fairly recent, I reviewed the book. And you can see underdevelopment of education. It refers to Walter Rodney, etc., underdevelopment of Africa. And he basically ends by saying, or I end the review by saying, it is a remarkable collection in these bleak, dire, and precarious times with constant assaults on reason and education for liberation. It is an antidote to despair. Hirji's injunction not to lose hope is also a clarion call to action and a firm belief that, and to quote him, the struggle is a long one, there are bound to be ups and downs, but ultimately Africa and its people will triumph, and in the same way that at a certain point, solidarity trumped lucre. Today, money, the donors, the threats of not having money dominates acts of solidarity, which is essential for a university, essential for knowledge, and that's how we progress as humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our speakers. It gives us a lot to think about. Very different perspectives going from some of the more institutional, embedded in, and I think we've all, if I pick up anything, there's a political economy of knowledge here that is one very formal and institutional about incentives, about rankings, about funding, for sure, but also a political economy of knowledge that we've inherited that's often less visible, which is about the very conceptual understandings of worth, of scholarship, of what it means to value knowledge, that also needs to be unpacked and perhaps challenged. The second thing I've learned is that the word decolonial, I read this in a meme, so it must be true, but has become something like Tabasco. It's like the sauce you put on everything, right? And it's become a sort of anonymous flavor, spices things up a little bit, but doesn't really add very much. And I think that there is definitely an element of that, and we have to be very careful when we use these terms, what it is that we really mean, and what not just to say them as a form of virtue signaling, but as a form of actually what challenges are we prepared to take and what kinds of unsettling are we really prepared to live with? We all work in these institutions. Those of us who are here have managed to find our way through them. Is it really something that we want to undermine, to take apart? Or is it something that we want, are we revisionists, or we want real revolution and change? And I think these are questions that we will continue to discuss. Rather than me try to ask some questions, I want to make sure that the audience who sat patiently through most of the afternoon to give a chance. I think it's Srila. You're hiding behind someone else. I could only see your head. Yes.
Because I have to go, so I'm just jumping in there. Thank you to everyone. But I just wanted to pick up on solidarity. Salim, and many of us here will know that it was very difficult to get universities in South Africa to show solidarity to Palestine. And even just saying that produces a very defensive reaction, I feel, among South Africans who think, just by virtue of their history and the government's position, that is just the way we look inward does precisely that damage, right? Where we're not thinking, we're not collaborating, we're not thinking elsewhere. On decolonization itself, I mean, I feel like I'm the only one who tells my students that it might be Tabasco, but at the hands of the Hindu right in India, it's poison. And nobody knows what here nobody knows that, right? Nobody knows that's happening. So there is a real cost of the exceptionality that South Africa attributes to itself, which is not just about the continent, which is, I would argue, much more global. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
There's also one online. I'll just read while we're getting the mic over there. This seems to be a question for, it's from Kezia. I hope I'm saying that right. For William, do you envision a reparative university, which you spoke about, existing in the space and form of the university we currently have? Or do you think for this to exist, it would need to exist outside, beyond the university of today? A second question, which I didn't notice, and for Salim, this is also from Kezia, as a lifelong activist academic, what advice do you have for us to remain ever critical and not despondent with the neoliberal university? You spoke of hope at the end, and perhaps you could help share ways in which we might find that hope. All right, so let me those questions for you, and then we'll have one and give you guys a chance.
Yes, so I'm thinking about the characteristics of a decolonial global South university that William laid out for us, and the specific powers that are preventing us from getting there. And I'm also thinking about how intimidating the task is of having to sort of dismantle neoliberalism or the commodification of the university or Afrophobia. So I'm thinking what can be done at a micro level, or what everyday actions can be taken by scholars for us to achieve the Global South University. And then the second question I have, which also links to the conversations we had in the first session, is as scholars, what privileges or powers can we forego to achieve the Global South University?
Samia had a question, but perhaps we could also, if you want to weigh in on any of these kind of questions, and raise your own, and then I'll just go down the hall.
Okay, thank you very much. It wasn't a question so much as an additional comment that perhaps links the issue of knowledge and borders to the issue of solidarity that you've just picked up. And this kind of like really is informed by some of my own experiences in my own practice. And what struck me in the conversation is that we have the word border in the title of this event, but we haven't really spoken much about it. And it always strikes me that, we say research, knowledge generation is borderless, yet we are, up with all of these borders. And you spoke about nations and disciplines, William, in particular. You talked about the professors and disciples. For me, an important border in our universities is the distinction that we make between academic and admin staff or support staff. And this is something that, for me, goes to the very heart of the decolonization conversation around whose knowledge matters. Because in many of our institutions, the knowledge of our professional and administrative staff does not matter as much as the academic knowledge. And I think this is something we need to actually grapple with. And I want to relate this directly to the issue of solidarity that you mentioned. In the past years, many of my colleagues, we have grappled with the question of our own individual agencies and how it links to the political positions of our institutions. A lot of that, not surprisingly, is around Palestine and, the South African government stance, the stance of universities or individuals and all of that. And we realized that, and I'm not going to mention the institution, but, there was a real case where a member of what we call administrative staff joined a Palestine solidarity group. And when things got difficult, we very quickly discovered that there is such a thing as academic freedom that protects the academics, but not a member of the administrative staff. And so I think when we talk about borders, this is something that we, I think, also really have to grapple with within our institutions. We talk about how do we engage with communities, and who are the expert professors that come and tell communities what to do. But we can look inward into our own institutions and how we engage with staff from across the spectrum, right? And I want to believe that an important inclusion conversation is to say, can we all be part of this project of the university and acknowledge that we're coming to it with very diverse perspectives, and that plurality of knowledges that we talk about when we talk about achieving epistemic decolonization, for example, that actually there are other dimensions to that that I think are really also important for us to tackle. So thank you.
Thank you. I think I can answer the two questions with one answer because they sort of refer to the same issue. That is the reparative university possible in the current state of the universities? I think that allows us to think about how can decolonization begin with us, in the sense that it will not involve only learning new ideas and new practices and new ways of producing and circulating knowledge, but it will also involve unlearning what has been systematized and structuralized into us. Because this received institution has given us certain habits that we have internalized. We can speak as much about decolonization, liberation, but when it comes to the lecture room, we are afraid really to challenge the hegemonic practices, ways of thinking, ways of teaching and learning that have been given to us. So the first part of the homework of decolonization is the art and the science of unlearning, so that we can have the courage to learn new ideas and new practices. Like what the Prof was saying, we are not orphaned of literature on decolonization in practice. In Africa, you can go as far back as Che Anta Diop on African origins of civilization. Then the 1950s and 1960s debate of the dependency theories. And Latin America has got Paulo Freire on the pedagogy of the oppressed and education for critical consciousness. All that literature is there, and it might look cliché, but it's got fresh meanings on what to decolonize in the education, including higher education and all that. What is needed is the courage to dare to implement the ideas and put across the practices and all that. Like Paulo Freire's suggestion that teachers and their students become co-learners and co-teachers. Instead of the professor standing on the pulpit there instructing and pronouncing ideas, you have this round table where students and their teachers co-teach and co-learn at the same time, which is a courageous thing to do if we want to decolonize. We undiscipline these practices and these ideas and all that. Thank you. I hope I've answered the question, Mr. Levi. Thank you.
I mean, these are very profound questions, and I think we're all really exhausted, and I think I spoke for too long. But I mean, for many of these issues and the role of academics and intellectuals, I think a really useful book still is Edward Said's Representations of the Intellectual, where he distinguishes between intellectuals and academics. Academics generally are conservative. I mean, we saw this during Fees Must Fall. But it doesn't mean it can't change in different ways, in creative ways. Also, the structure of the university prevents you from becoming too critical, for the sake of promotions, in terms of working together, and you dare not work with colleagues in other universities because, we have to check our rankings and all of that. So it militates against that kind of vision we have. But just to say that there's always progressive spaces. And while it is constrained, they do exist all over. And we need to make common cause with students and colleagues in other universities and through programs. But very importantly, and I don't think we've paid enough attention to that, is, there have been some examples. If you look at the Albert Street fire, this horrific fire, there was just a commemoration. But the real potential of academics and students linking up with those communities. If you look at what Basi Benjen Dolo, the shack dwellers organization, did against Operation Dudula, with some NGOs and academics, etc. So a lot of the changes and attacking these reactionary things must come not just with universities, but in concert with social movements and the people on the outside. And they need to play a more prominent role in demanding that the universities must be public institutions. Stephen Salaita wrote a wonderful, he was dismissed from the university, etc., became a bus driver for school kids. He's back in the university, I think. But he was talking about how the real intellectuals are outside. Quite often we confuse intellectuals because, and certainly in our country where PhDs are so easy to come by, you don't need to work too hard, you just need the right connections. It's equated with being an intellectual. When people who don't have credentials, they philosophize in communities, in structures, they strategize, they read, like we did in the past when we had Bantu education, So I think we need to always remember that. And finally, of course, this is cliche, but Raymond William, the book he wrote was about alternatives. And that famous quote that we need to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. I think that only comes not from book work, but through praxis, as Paulo Freire said. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Fantastic. I know that we have two questions. This gentleman in the white hat, then the woman in the green hair, and then I think who can ask, and then there's two more. So if you can keep them quick, this will be the last round, since we need to get people home, but let's start back there. Yeah.
Okay, afternoon everybody. My name is Dinchitile Mashile. I'm from Drama for Life. Currently studying my MA in Applied Drama and Theatre in Education, Social Contexts and Communities. Dr. Mpofu has addressed this, but I got the mic before he spoke, and then I was like, let me just be courageous anyway. But speaking back to this idea of the word border, I was constantly thinking about what we're currently studying, which is Henry Giroux' Border Crossings, and he speaks on the discourse of difference and voice, and he's supported quite profoundly by Bell Hooks' Transgressing Education, and just this idea of looking at those boundaries as these marginalized spaces that we can't really quite smash through, but how then, or rather, how many lecturers and students are really actioning, being performing in a way of praxis towards dismantling these things, and not really like looking at it from a point where it does feel intimidating, but starting in such spaces because we all occupy the university space. How many lecturers are being courageous despite all the other things that exist, like, you know, is that up? So many different aspects and things that kind of get in the way of them doing that. But I just think that these things are cliche and corny. We speak to the freres, we speak to the hooks. They've been speaking on these themes for years. They are cliche because they are true. And I'm just really wondering what would it take really for us to really have these conversations in a different way? How do we have them when we turn them on their head? You know, how would this space be different, having this conversation where it meant we sat around in a circle, or, you know, I don't know. There's actually many, many ideas that we could sit and really speak to in regards to challenging these notions. Thank you.
So just like to piggyback on what she was saying, my question goes in one part. Well, it's one question in two parts. She states what would need to be there. I just phrased it as you were making key points that at every shift, like at every, there have to be power shifts for there to be things to happen. So for the university, what would this imagined university, what would the conditions need to be for us to then witness this imagined new university? And how will this happen when systems have a tendency of reproducing people that defend these very systems that they did not create? And I think it was Zizek who said that. So how will the people in the fraternity be able to then change this university into something new, because they are already now defenders? And how will, because of how the incentive structure of the academy work, where will this new money come from to change course and, you know, establish this new imagined university? That's one part of three.
Thank you so much for a very, very insightful talk. My name is Brian, and I'm with the African Center for Migration and Society. My question revolves around the intersection of transformation and digitalization. My understanding is that we are living in the digital age. And for me, if you do not have control over the digital space, you do not have control over the narrative. And given this context, then, how should the future of South African or African universities in general look like in a context where we hardly really control the digital space? Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you to the panel. I think the conversation was really productive. I think there's some interesting themes coming up and a lot of thinking about how we disentangle ourselves. But I wanted to talk around the issue of solidarity, you know? And there's always, you know, when we have conversations around xenophobia, generally, academic xenophobia specifically, that kind of have these shorthand, hey, we also know we are in a post-colonial moment wherever I come from, and so therefore what are you talking about? South Africa is not exceptional, right? But I think there's a kind of limitation in that critique because it presupposes that the colonial experience was the same thing, right? There's also the reality of a settled colony, which manifests in a particular way in post-colonially, right? And that we seriously need to think about. And then secondly, there's something around the issue of solidarity with students, right? So why do students not partake in activism, right? And I've been thinking about my own students and how as far back as 10 years ago, the architecture students were not involved in Fees Must Fall or Roads Must Fall, right? Because we are the hard sciences somewhat. And we shouldn't be dealing with this stuff. But there's also, like, recently, there's the conversation with Palestine, and I've been having conversations with my students about how they can't show solidarity with Palestine. When I don't even get the support, like I've worn T-shirts with insignia that indicated I was in support of or in solidarity with people in Palestine, and then you get pressure from the institution, And so imagine if that kind of pressure bears down on me. What does it look like for students who, in actual fact, demographically, if I look at the kind of students I get, because I'm at UJ, so we are slightly poorer than you guys. Our students, this is a literal thing. I have a student who goes back to Katlehong, or had Katlehong in an informal settlement, and is totally cut off the network because they do not have access to a phone or access to networks when they are there, right? And you come back to your university, and you're sitting with your colleagues, and then you try to communicate the plight of students, to them, because some of my friends are still in Soweto. And there's a kind of like aloofness about the reality of what South Africa actually looks like, the material conditions of what South Africa looks like, and the kind of experiences our students have, right? And so how do we, and this is the challenge to all of us as academics, to kind of move away from kind of the university and actually move into the communities where our students come from. I think there's a disconnect. There is absolutely no way, if you understand the conditions and the plight of students who make up the bulk of the students we get, and you can come and make a statement that suggests that students are not in solidarity. They cannot afford to be. They cannot afford to be. I've had many instances of students who, if you blunder once, you're out of the system and it's game over, and you're back in an informal settlement, and that's your fate. And I think we need to, I think there's a kind of empathy in the conversations with the plight of our students that is missing from the conversations we have. And I wonder how you guys are thinking about these things or like kind of like the micro scale of how we think about solidarity. And I'd like to hear it. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. I mean, as the colleague from Drama for Life has suggested, these are conversations we should have around a table that would go on for longer than we're going to have time for today. I just want to read very quickly two, I think, quite similar, well, overlapping questions that came in online, just to add to the conversation, but you can choose to reply to what you'd like. This is another one from Kingdom, which I'll just read the first line, which I think echoes some of the conversations we've been having already. To what extent does the invocation of the term decoloniality genuinely invite inclusive and critical dialogue, or is it, is it a cover? And the next question from Simpiwe Mlambo, similarly to all the panelists. Many were brought into universities under the banner of transformation, but was this genuine change or a radical act of concealment? I think both difficult and provocative questions, but we can just go in the same order we've been going in. If you just have time a few minutes to respond to as many or as few questions as you'd like. So.
All right, quickly, one way of engaging with borders, epistemic, ontological, national, and otherwise, is to attempt to actually think from the borders. There's a nice concept by, people always attribute this to Walter Mignolo, but it's actually Gloria Anzaldúa on border thinking, which allows us to go through the vulnerability of positioning ourselves in the peripheries in order to see the centers and understand what is happening to us and with us. Illustratively, those that one day will go to Pretoria, like if you are going down this direction and you happen to be in those few meters where this road divides Sandton and Tembisa and Alex. If you just stand there and look at inequality performed, inequality illustrated, inequality demonstrated and dramatized in 1 square mile, I think it allows you to see things afresh about the realities of the people that live meters away from each other, but actually live different existences in one province, in one location, in one country. And there's a lot of knowledge right there. Right, one way of doing that as well, these critical conversations are actually doing something about this, because when each one of us leaves this room, hopefully there's something we are going to do about what we heard and what we see. Because thoughtless action is as problematic as actionless thought. So the assumption is that we do something about what emanates from these critical conversations. Right here, on decoloniality, like Edward Said taught us, that theories travel. There's no one idea or one theory or one philosophy called decoloniality. I've encountered scholars that ideologize decoloniality, that chant slogans, and you can tell now this is an ideology. Others advance it as a theory that still has to be tested in action, falsified, and discovered. And some do advance it as a philosophy, a framework of reflecting on the history of colonization, enslavement, and all that. And activism, the daily attempts at undoing the effects of colonization, coloniality, and the aftermath of apartheid and all that. And there is what we as individuals can do within our own circles and all that. Right, in parting, there's a very interesting essay, an interesting essay of 2016, thank you, written by Professor Robert Fricker. It's titled Shredding the Veil of Apartheid, or Shredding the Role of Reconciliation. It's freely available online. It talks about the actual history of the universities in South Africa, when they were started and how they were started, and that they started as college campuses of universities in the West. And their motto in the beginning was, for the education of the sons of empire. For the education of the sons of empire. And they were funded by the landlords, empire builders, and other powerful figures to develop new colonizers for Africa that were going to take the ropes from the invaders and other settlers that came before them. So the work of undoing that whole history, challenging that whole history, is going to be a lot, but it's feasible and it's doable. And thinking about it, reading about it is a step towards that. Thank you.
Okay, I promise I'm not going to be longer than a minute. I think these questions, it's impossible to do justice to them. Just very quickly about technology. It's not an argument against technology or the importance of technology or learning technological skills, which changes all the time. But fundamentally, it's a political, economic, ecological crisis. The very technology can make it worse, or it can make it better. It can address it. So what is the purpose of technology? With the present global political economy, with the billionaires like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, etc., they're using technology in a way that doesn't address the critical problems we have. And of course, them terraforming outer space or colonizing Mars, it's not going to solve the ecological crisis or climate catastrophe at all. So, in fact, it increases inequality. It increases the digital divide between countries, within countries, based on class, race, etc., etc. Even worse, it is used in the same way. A very educated, at that time, technologically advanced country used technology. And I'm talking about Nazi Germany, where they developed ways of killing people on an industrial scale. And that is what AI, so all I'm saying, that we need to have a critical understanding of technology, understand who owns it, what role they play, and for whose benefit, and does it address the issues we are confronted with and that we've been talking about. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Just a short kind of like final reflection and not an attempt to respond to any of the many relevant questions, but perhaps just to bring two things together. Salim, you asked earlier whether it's actually possible to decolonize the neoliberal university, and it reminded me of something that I heard Professor Walter Minolo say, and you mentioned his name, so I thought that's a good way of bringing this together. And he was asked that very same question in a lecture that I attended in 2018 at the University of Pretoria, where somebody asked him, you know, is the mission of decolonizing the university not a mission impossible? Because if we want to do that, but we recognize that the university as we know it today is a very colonial construct, that we have to do away with the entire thing. And he said, yeah, that's one way you can look at it, but another one is to say, you know, when we acknowledge this, we can occupy spaces within these institutions where we find an opportunity to work. And I think this links to what you've just said, the responsibility of everyone, including ourselves, to think about what is it actually, what's my sphere of influence or control or, you know, possible way of bringing about a change. And I think that is something that gives me hope, you know, in every one of these conversations, because inclusion work, decolonization work by its very nature is, I think, extremely difficult, very often uncomfortable, sometimes dangerous. And if we can kind of like find these smaller spaces and things that we can do, that is something that gives me hope and agency, you know, and that is something that perhaps, you know, we can all walk away with, to think after these extremely enriching and very diverse and very rich conversations, to say, you know, what is it that we're walking away with from here? But thank you for the platform.
Right. All right, I'm going to continue the thanks as I wrap up. So first of all, let me just take this opportunity to first of all thank all of the speakers, not just the three here, but the three that were there. And then to also thank my co-conspirators who helped bring this together, so Nikki, Lorena, Samia, and others, the NRF and the other capitalist dark forces that fund us, right, who've made this possible. And those who are behind the scenes, so Lenore, Sasanda, the film crew, who've been wonderful, Brian, others, Bothwell, who put up posters, and all my colleagues, and of course all those who joined for all or part of the day, either here at WITS at the library or online, and we had at points almost 40 people there, so that is a cause for hope. I also just, on this issue of hope, I think Nikki began with an anecdote, so let me try to end with one, which is, part of the time I spend at Oxford, and, if there's a colonial university, I mean, that's it, right? I mean, and the roads must fall resonated there, as Lorena messaged. There was a promise to literally try to take down the Rhodes statue. The Rhodes statue is still there. It now has a little sign next to it indicating that some people say he was a colonialist and an imperialist. No judgment on whether that's a good or a bad thing, but they've acknowledged at least. But does that mean that the university is not falling? No, Oxford is falling. The British universities are in enormous decline. They've shut themselves off from the world. They recruit students purely as commodities. The system is so commodified that their forms of knowledge, maybe not in the sciences, not that the knowledge that feeds the pharmaceutical industry, but in the humanities and history, they're closing departments. They're declining. The American universities also, the colonial universities that we reference, also lost billions in the last year, struggling to figure out a financial model that works. So we may say, as much as we want to change, the university as it was is collapsing anyway, without us, right? But that points to another issue, is that those universities are probably not the imperial universities of the future. I got a call yesterday from a Chinese student who has spent their time studying Swahili, right, to facilitate how China can engage better in Africa, right? There are new forms of knowledge already taking shape, and they're not necessarily progressive. So taking the point that Srila raised, that decolonization is not necessarily a good thing, right? That decolonization and getting rid of the old empire can not just make space for liberation, but can also make space for new forms of imperialism. And we need to think and identify those. These groups that may have been our allies, the Indians, the Chinese, et cetera, in the past, are now also producing universities, and they're funding universities in Africa, the Confucius Institutes. Turkey is funding studies across the way of Islam for particular sorts of projects. And we need to also be thinking about what those look like. And I think to think what that means for us now, and how we teach, and the kind of ways in which we unsettle what's here. And I would say that one of the things we can do is, I studied in grad school one of the most boring topics, public administration, right? But this is where you can make change now, right? Of how do we change our key performance areas? How do we change how people get promoted? How do we change how students move through the systems? These are things we can do, right? And they can try in time. It won't happen tomorrow, but this is how we create a change in the sector, in the political economy of higher education. And I think that, Judith Butler, I take some inspiration from her of suggesting that we do not need necessarily a fully fleshed out alternative before we start undermining the systems that are here, so that the next generation we make space for them. And one of the things that's been very obvious to me up here is that we haven't had students speaking, right? And we are inspired by them. Many of us, all of us, I think, have made reference to them, to the Fees Must Fall movement, and yet we haven't brought them in. And I think that was an intentional choice, right? Partially, there's a limited amount of time, but in part because I think academics have spent the last few years hiding behind the students, sometimes afraid to speak, let they be canceled, let they be attacked, but also because we haven't wanted to put ourselves out there in a highly contentious space. And I think people today have taken our invitation to do that. And I wanted to, again, just thank you. This is part of a continuing conversation. I know across the School of Social Sciences, I can't say about physics or chemistry what's going on, but I hope those conversations are happening there as well. But I just want to thank all of you in closing for being part of that conversation today. So, we hope to see you again back here soon, and to thank everybody. So have a good evening.